Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. One of the education buzzwords of the last decade is STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Not only have schools tried to find ways to improve their STEM curricula, but they have struggled to make the content more accessible. This situation is exacerbated by the notion that many students are intimidated by science or otherwise find it uninteresting or too difficult. While teachers have livened up science through labs and projects and other hands-on experiences, one area that isn't tapped enough is the at-home classroom. Add to this the fact that science materials can be expensive or dangerous, and it becomes a daunting task to make science more interesting. Enter Dr. Stephanie Ryan, who has a strong background in chemistry and biology and a passion for developing curriculum and education products to make science more interesting and accessible to parents as well as students. In fact, her Let's Learn About Science Instagram account is designed to remind parents that they are more qualified to teach science than they think. Today, Dr. Ryan joins us to discuss how to make science your child's favorite subject and turn your kitchen into a fun laboratory. Dr. Ryan, welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, it is definitely our pleasure to have you here because I have a background in education as well. And one of the subjects I taught is science. And so I'm kind of a science geek when it comes to these things. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you here today. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into it because we've often heard that parents are considered like the child's first teacher. And so how important is it that parents really embrace science as well as for their children?
Well, I think we all know this, that we can get fears from our parents, right? If your mom's afraid of spiders and she freaks out around spiders, you might be afraid of spiders too, even though you actually don't know anything about them. The same is true with math and science phobia. And a lot of parents had bad experiences in school, and they'll sometimes put it off with their kids. And then their kids are like, oh, I don't know about math. I don't know about science. And the thing that I think parents forget is they might not like the math equations, and they may not have had a good experience in a laboratory, but science and math are literally all around us all the time, everything we do all day long. And your kid is interested in so many things that involve science that it's not what you think it is. And I think that it's important for parents to kind of help their kids, one, learn to observe the world around them, help them do that. Help them compare and contrast. Those, you wouldn't think that's science, but that's science. And so that's the thing I like to remind parents is that there's a lot of stuff that you're not considering science as science.
How did you develop your love of science? Did your parents instill that in you, or did you just kind of pick it up along the way? Did your natural curiosity just kind of take control? How did you get your love of science?
I would love to say that I was naturally curious, but I was not. My dad was an engineer, and he really pushed the science hard. School is very important. I signed you up for a summer camp. You were doing science, and then I grew to like it. And later in my life, having a child, I have learned to love science even more because I look at it through his eyes. And I look at the basic building block concepts and try to build it up. And it's just so fascinating to see the world that way instead of this way that I learned it through books and facts. Like, this is the fact you will learn. Here is your A, where he is looking at it as like, what explains that? And I just think that's such a healthier way to approach it. And so that's what really, now I'm a very curious person. But when I first started out, it was not in science necessarily.
Do you think that based on that observation you just made about yourself and based on your experience as a classroom teacher as well, do you think that may be a positive approach for teachers to make as far as teaching the subject through the lens or through the eyes of your students as opposed to through the eyes or your own lens?
I think that's important for any adult to do, to take a step back, because I know when I was teaching, it was what is relevant to me might not be relevant to them, and you can't force relevance onto a student. It's either relevant to them or not. So I used to have an idea of what I was going to teach, and I let the kids kind of come up with some of it. But at some point, you have a curriculum you have to adhere to. So I think teachers, they have a really tough time with it. But at home, like, you can do whatever you want at home. And there's so many ways to approach it. So one way I approached during the pandemic, my son was 3 when it started, and we did pre-K. And I would say, what do you want to learn about this week? And he would be like, can we talk about bugs? And I'm like, oh, okay. So I had to pretend I'm not afraid of these bugs that he came up from the yard and handed me. And I had to like, oh, great, But we were able to talk about plants and the life cycle of bugs and what's the difference between an insect and a spider. And there's just all these things you could teach that I didn't even think about. And they might come in different order than a textbook would approach it, but he's getting all this information through something he loves. And there are tons of books out there. So you can teach some reading skills, right? You can do the sight words that way. And you could read the book to your child, have them read the sight words, or use Teachers Pay Teachers and find a cut and paste counting activity that uses bugs. So you can use it as the vehicle to get your kid into it, but then teach all sorts of stuff. And that's something that at home you can do and you have the time to do that. Teachers just, they don't have that time. So I don't think it's fair to say like, hey, you need to do it this way. I think I like the way science has changed since I was a kid. The NGSS standards, you look at phenomena based. I think that's fantastic. And I think it'll get a group of kids coming out of school that are going to just know science in such a different way than the rest of us did. But I think that at home, you can just do so much more.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I want to go a little bit deeper, not all the way into it, but can you explain a little bit more about the benefits or the differences between the next generation science standards, or NGSS, and the old way, quote unquote, old way of teaching science?
So the old way was the way I went through it, and I'm not sure, maybe you as well. It was, here's a book, here are your facts, and you're going to be tested just on the facts. You didn't need to know why or how or be able to explain something at like the particulate level in a chemistry reaction. You just needed to know how to balance it. You needed to know that this is the outcome. And that's not that helpful. As an adult, I can tell you, I know the equations, PV equals nRT, but I'll tell you, when I met my husband, and he was asking me questions like, well, okay, so the air in the tires goes down when it's cold, but why? And I was like, PV equals nRT. And he's like, that didn't tell me anything. And he's like, do you even know? And I'm like, I don't actually. I need to think about this at the particulate level. And so starting kids out that way, like, there is matter, there are particles, and then having them use those concepts to explain things that are happening, it's just flipping it, so that the what doesn't matter really. It's the how and the why that really matter. And then it also takes in those skills I was talking about, like comparing and contrasting, asking questions, justifying your claim with evidence. That's something that a lot of adults don't even do. And so these are skills that are really important just in life, but they're practices that people do. And then finding patterns in data, finding patterns in the world around you. You'd be surprised. My son picks out patterns in his Legos sometimes, or we'll be driving by a building and it'll have a pattern and he'll point that out. Just even that is important. And so this NGSS pulls those 3 things together. It's the content, the skills, and the kind of concepts that like pattern finding all together. And it's like looking at a concept that way instead of just like, here's a fact. And it's just so different.
You're right. I've taught it myself, and I've tried to do a crosswalk with teachers on how to go from the old set of standards to the new set of standards and so forth. And they, even when they realize what the NGSS is all about, you can see the excitement grow in the teachers as well, because they're like, finally, we can actually do stuff in the classroom, as opposed to, okay, turn to page 35 and write down these questions and so forth. It makes science come alive. And I think that's what our students need to get excited and to get engaged in the subjects themselves.
Well, and to even be able to apply it later. So a lot of those concepts, like you think about attraction between molecules and repulsion, a lot of stuff is explained by just Coulomb's law. And it's funny because in writing curricular materials, I had to look at the periodic table through that lens. And I was like, why didn't anybody tell me this? Like it would have made so much more sense to look at it in terms of Coulomb's law and why it pulls an electron from somebody else versus giving it up, and like it just makes so much more sense. And you can apply that later and to magnets and to other things, and it's just so, yeah, I'm envious of my child growing up in school, like that he's got that, but we still haven't figured out how to assess that as well. I know that it's hard to do all three skills at the same time. And there's some of the skills in there, like modeling, that's hard to assess on a test. And so that's still something that I think is getting itself worked out, and it's getting better. But in the classroom, it's such rich conversations from the students.
And I think one other thing that you touched on earlier that parents and also teachers and other caregivers may kind of overlook is the importance of just reading the science content to our students, because I know a lot of the on the standardized exams, whether it's the SAT or the ACT or even just a regular middle school test, a lot of those passages are science-based. The content is based in science. And so if the students actually understand the science and are exposed to that content, when they read those passages, is not as boring to them anymore. Now they can actually get more into it.
Yeah, I think too, the NGSS kind of pulls a little bit away from vocabulary. So I'm interested to see where that goes, because I feel like my PhD advisor, he'd tell me, why use a quarter word when you could use a nickel one? And I feel like it's more like that it doesn't matter that you know the name of the law. It's that you know what the law is, like how it works. And so I'm curious how those science passages will change over time by removing some of that. But yeah, definitely. And then even just reading and hearing about the words and the content. So I've trained my son. You can tell he's a scientist kid, especially an educator's kid. He looks for changes in things. And then he looks at whether they're solids, liquids, or gases. And so he can tell you whether a chemical change or a physical change happened because it's not a liquid anymore. It's not solid anymore, or like it made bubbles or things like that. And so I think that too is something that you can teach very early when you're reading, or doing an experiment with your kid. Like, did something change? Tell me about it. Like getting them to feel comfortable with their words.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is the science crusader behind the Instagram account, Let's Learn About Science, and author of the children's book, Let's Learn About Chemistry, Dr. Stephanie Ryan. Now, Dr. Ryan, I actually want to get into that Instagram account of yours because it seems that it's kind of like I don't want to say is the poor man's Bill Nye science guy type of thing, but it makes it a little bit more accessible and more relatable for the millennials, this generation of parents. So tell us about what was the motivation behind developing that account, and who is it really geared towards?
It's funny because it started out as an author account for my book, and the book was launched at the beginning of the pandemic, and I couldn't do live readings at bookstores and all of that, and it was like, what can we do? And so instead of looking at it in the negative way, we were like, okay, let's use social media. And so I started showing experiments I did with my son, and I started getting questions like, I would never have thought to ask that question, that you asked your son. And I was like, huh. And so I started to ponder that a bit. And then I didn't realize that this would last so long. And I had my son home from pre-K for a long time. And I was starting to be like, what is he missing out on? Am I even a good teacher? And I got in my own head, like parents do, like, am I the best person to show him this? So I talked to his preschool teacher. teacher, and she was like, you know more than you think you do with a child. Like, you already, just being alive, have had the life experience, and you can teach them a lot of stuff that you're overthinking this. And so I thought, if I'm overthinking this, I'm an educator, a scientist, and I'm overthinking STEM at home, then parents must be who are not. And I found while writing my book that there's a niche market for science books. If you're a scientist and you have a baby, you get books from people that are like science for baby books, but that doesn't happen elsewhere. It's not very accessible. STEM toys, the word STEM is labeled on so many things that aren't really STEM or don't explain how they connect. And I just think parents don't know how to wade through that. And if they're intimidated, then they just might not do it. And so I wrote my book so that the parents have the answers, that they can work through this with their kids so that they don't feel dumb. Because you never want to feel dumb when you teach your kids something. It just is really off-putting for you as a parent. And so the account just switched gears. It was like, how can I help parents? What can we do at home? A lot of people can't get out right now. What are we going to do? So I focused all my activities on things you could find mostly around your house. On occasion, there are a few that I have to get, but and then I try to ask questions. Ask your kid this, ask your kid that. And then I do demonstrations of how to do it. And sometimes we do live activities. So that it kind of pivoted, but then stayed.
Yeah, so I know you have that first book, let's talk about chemistry. So have you thought about maybe creating a series of books or videos that talk about the other branches of science?
Thought about it, and that's how I ended up Let's Learn About Science instead of Let's Learn About Chemistry as the whole account and the website. So I do have other ideas of what to do. Just publishing a book it's an intense process, and we just got out of, the pandemic is still obviously happening, but my son's back in school, and so I'm just wrapping my hands around what does it mean to be an influencer on TikTok and Instagram, because I never was that before.
How can these important and sometimes complex scientific concepts be taught using items you can find in your kitchen?
Should I just show you one?
Sure. This one you can talk through a
Great.
couple of experiments.
Great. So I'll start with a common one that people do: baking soda and vinegar. So kids love this. I, as a parent, was shocked that my son can do this for 2 years and still loves this experiment. I don't understand. I find it really boring, and I almost never do it because I'm like, he's probably over it, but he's not. It's crazy. So because it makes a mess. That's why they like it. Oh yeah, they love the mess. They love the bubbling, and then he loves to change how fast he pours vinegar to see if it makes a difference. And he's doing a little experiment without me talking about an experiment. So you put baking soda into a bowl. A clear bowl helps so you can see the what's about to happen. But you ask your kid, what is this? Is this, well, they're like, it's white, it's solid. And you're like, okay, now I have a cup of vinegar. And you ask them, what is that? And you're like, well, it's a clear, colorless liquid. And you're like, what do you think is going to happen when you add the two? And so they'll tell you, and they're going to be wrong. And that's okay. It's okay to be wrong. And then you have them dropper it or pour if you don't have droppers at home. I realize that's not a common home tool. And you ask them what's happening, and it fizzes and it bubbles. And you ask them, what do you think's inside the bubbles? Is there more than you started with? Like, would this weigh the same before and after? And the answer is, the way I've just done it in a bowl, no, because that gas escapes the bubbles. And so it actually weigh less, which violates the law of conservation of mass in their heads. And so then my son loves to, mommy, can I pour it? So you can see, like, does it do more if it pours? And so you're looking for changes and things that are the same to compare. And you can do this with older kids too. And you can ask them, okay, so that gas has escaped. Is there any way we could design something so that it doesn't escape? And you could come up with a bottle that has vinegar in the bottom and a balloon that has baking soda in it. And you can wrap it around the lip, and you've now made a closed system. So now that gas doesn't have anywhere to escape. And when you do it, the balloon will blow up and it will still fizz, but the balloon blows up. And this is evidence that a gas was formed. So you can show that gas is real. Can't see it, but it's here. And you can show that a system has been made. And you could even, if you have a kitchen scale, way before and after, and show that closing the system changed it. So there are simple things like that. And then the other thing I like to look at is, does it mix or does it not mix? So oil and water, super easy stuff to use. And then you add food coloring to make it fun. So I've got a glass here that has food coloring. I used blue so you could see it on the screen. And it's mixed with water. So food coloring and water mix, but there's a layer here that forms with the oil. And so your kid can look, things mix, things don't mix. I can think about this. And what I do is we then drop an Alka-Seltzer tablet or citric acid, depending on where people live, because Alka-Seltzer isn't sold everywhere. You drop it in, and what happens, give it a second to start reacting, the bubbles start coming up. That's carbon dioxide bubbles. Those are going up, and they are less dense than the oil. So they go up, but then when they pop, they go back down. And so the food coloring still doesn't mix with oil because the water didn't, and it pops back down, and you've made a lava lamp. And you can redo this for a really long time. It lasts several days by just adding more and more until the water can't react anymore. And then I like to flip that one on its head with a cup of water. So you just have a cup of water, and you take oil and you drop her in 2 drops of 2 different colors of food coloring, whatever colors you want except yellow. For some reason, yellow doesn't work. So just don't do that, anyone who's listening. And you have just a teeny bit of oil, and you're stirring it, and it makes these little tiny bubbles of food coloring in the oil, because again, they don't mix. You're going to add it to the top of the water, and you make fireworks in a glass, because as the color droplets start to hit the water, they mix, but they don't do that until they fall. And so this you can watch this for like 20 minutes and watch the colors swirl, and kids love this one. So I just really like to use common household stuff like this. This whole thing together probably costs $1.50. And you can do this at home and teach a lot of stuff with it. And then your kid can keep doing it. My son would do this one 100 times too. And they can take a video of it if you have a smartphone, and if you play it in reverse, or you flip it over, and they can do other tech things with it as well. So those are just some fun, easy ones that I like to do with things that mix, they don't change, doesn't change, solid, liquid, gas.
Now, I know you've described these projects were great, and I'm sure that our listeners will tackle these right away. But you also have other projects that are kind of holiday specific or theme specific. We just had St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure you have a couple of examples for that. And you also have Halloween projects people can do. And so what are some of those other theme related projects that you described?
So a lot of people who are into baking or making cookies with their kids and things, they'll have those silicone molds for holidays, and you can do a lot with those. So you could melt broken crayons in them in the oven and make new crayons that are in shapes of holiday shapes. I'm about to do that for Earth Day to make Earths. I'm really excited about it. So that teaches about reusing and recycling, and you are melting, and sometimes crayons of different brands melt at different rates. And so you can kind of even get into the different physical properties of different waxes if you really wanted to, why does that happen? Or why doesn't it melt until it hits a certain temperature? And you can kind of look at that. And then the silicone molds can also be used to take baking soda paste that you just mix, baking soda, just a little tiny bit of water, and then some food coloring, and you put that into the silicone mold and freeze it, and you make those shapes, and then you use droppers of vinegar and do the reaction with that after it's frozen. So those are fun. And then we make the lava lamps with different glitters for different holidays. There's so many, and every holiday I have 5 to 10 depending on the holiday. Some holidays are easier to do.
How can our listeners and anyone else get a hold of these different experiments that you describe and be able to see you actually demonstrate them in person?
Yeah, I'm on most platforms. I cycle between Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Right now, Facebook is taking off a bit, but I post it on all the platforms. So wherever you're most comfortable. Sometimes I'll host a live event on Facebook or Instagram where I do the experiment with people. And so you show up with your balloon and bottle and everything, and we do it together. And those are really fun to do. So you just follow those accounts at Let's Learn About Science for information. And if you ever have a question, I'm super available on those. If you send a message, I love to answer fan questions. So yeah.
So let me just to clarify for everybody, in order on every platform, it's the same thing as Let's Learn About Science is the same title for on every platform.
Yes.
All one word. Let's Learn About Science, all one word. Sounds great. Now, let me also ask you this, because again, you were a classroom teacher at one point, and you have a vast experience in the sciences. So what do you think can be done to make science more interesting and accessible to girls and students of color?
I think one is through what I'm saying of using materials that you can find at home to show that it can be done everywhere. I think that representation is 100% the way to go, making sure that students see that people who look just like them are scientists. And there are a lot of accounts on Instagram dedicated to that. Like I am a scientist, of where you hold up a sign and then you talk about your research, and just showing them that science is not static, it's dynamic. People are doing it right now, and those people look just like you. And I think that that's so important for a kid to know that they can do that.
Do you have any other plans of perhaps, I don't know, expanding your science empire, or maybe even partnering with some of the other those authors in books that will kind of support the work that you're doing?
I do have plans to expand to go onto YouTube and do speaking events where I might record for a company who is looking to do a STEM day for girls or things like that, to work with them and maybe someday in person again. I think that the collaboration idea is super important, and it's something that, I mean, you double the audience who gets to hear it. And I think that's great. So yeah, there are a few authors who write in the same genre as me that we've talked about doing something together, and I'm excited about those.
And if you had, I guess, to leave our audience with just one final thought about the importance of making science fun, what would that be?
I think that science is fun. I don't think we have to make it fun. I think that what we need to do is just open our mind a little bit and remember that it's fun. Because for a while for us, it may not have been the way we were taught, but science is all around us. It's everywhere. It's our everyday. You wash dishes, you clean your clothes, like there's science involved there. And just showing that that's so important in the daily life, that it doesn't, I just don't think we have to make it interesting. I think that there's always something there, like space launches and things like that. There's just something always cool that you could tie it back to science.
Yeah, so I think that it's like you said, it's not that science has to be made fun, because it is. It just has to be more accessible, and we have to remember that we can use everyday, ordinary household items to remind our students that just how much fun they can actually have doing it. Again, we'd like to thank our guest, the science crusader behind the Instagram account Let's Learn About Science, and author of the children's book Let's Learn About Chemistry, Dr. Stephanie Ryan. Thanks for coming on our show today.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.